to do God's will.
The kind of revolution that the world needs is a Christian revolution.
If you want a miracle, you've got to expect it to happen.
You are the recipients of God's grace and God's blessings, and you rejoice in that reality.
Welcome to Life Today Live. Great to have you here today. We're going to hit a little bit of an update on the Ukraine situation when it comes to the orphans. Nobody thought that the war there would go on this long, and it's kind of faded from some of the headlines, but the situation is still very real, so we want to touch on that. And you're going to hear a personal story with a connection to Ukraine that I think will warm your heart and give you some hope in these difficult times. My guest today is Dr. Rick Morton, and he is with Lifeline Children's Services. He is one of the premier orphanologists in the country. I don't know if that's a word, but it is today. And in fact, he wrote a book called Orphanology, Awakening to Gospel-Centered Adoption and Orphan Care. And I just like the whole framing of that. And so when you look at like Lifeline Children's Services, and you're talking adoption, foster care, care for orphans around the world, as well as helping mothers who are, to be pregnant, women who are pregnant who need some assistance. And to me, this is, I don't know, throw a scripture at you, back it up real fast, but this is the gospel in action. So you're going to get a real good picture of that today. Appreciate you guys being here. If you're watching us live, you're invited to be a part of the chat. And Rick, great to have you here on Life Today Live. Welcome to the show.
Randy, thanks. It's good to be here. One of the ways to success is if you invent a term and then you become the authority in it. And so, but in all joking aside, orphanology actually came from the concept of combining our love and our care for orphans with our theology, and it coming out of our understanding of who God is. And so we wrote that book because we really firmly believe that when we're caring for orphans, we're living out God's character before the world. We're showing the world who our God is, because ultimately we are those children. We are those orphans in a spiritual sense, and the work that Jesus has done has redeemed us, and so that kind of flows out of everything that we are. But it's also a pretty good strategy if you can invent a word and then well, kind of build your life around it.
Yeah, it makes a lot more sense than the words that the world is inventing today, like pronouns and stuff. But that's interesting that you tie the spiritual in with it as well. We know from James, this is pure and undefiled religion, right? Taking care of the orphans. The gospel of Paul when he went to the apostles, and they confirmed what the gospel itself is, and they said, and just one more thing, if you're going to add anything to the gospel, you better be careful. But they said, remember the poor, right? And Paul said, I was eager to do so. So, it's easy, especially in our culture today, to get, a little hyper-focused on certain aspects and not necessarily keep this in mind. But I guess I'm getting a little old and crotchety, but I'm tired of a lot of the religious kind of stuff. And I'm like, can we just take care of poor people? Can we remember people in their misery? Can we help the widows and the orphans? And you guys have really done a good job of that.
Well, thank you. It really comes from a conviction that this is just an outworking of the gospel. It's an outworking of who we are, and who Christ has redeemed us to be. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of us have probably spent at least a portion of our lives being scared of the social gospel.
Just thinking, right? I was literally just thinking that, yeah.
And truly, Randy, that's something to be fearful of, because I think anytime you add an adjective to the gospel, you're moving away from truth. And what we're convinced of is this is not about a social gospel. It's just about the gospel, and it's about people who have been born again, people that have been changed by Jesus, acting like our Father. And when we go not just to take care of children in their distress. We go not just to help today, but we go we go bearing the gospel. And so the best thing we have to bring to them is not food or clothing or shelter or any of those things. It's not family even. The best thing that we have to bring to them is Jesus and the hope that, that comes in Christ. And so when we talk about adoption, we're very squarely talking about placing children into families where they're gonna know Jesus and where they're gonna be taught to follow Christ. And it's not just about an interim solution to put them into a safe place to find a way to a Christless eternity. The whole passion behind what we do is a driving passion to see kids that are, once vulnerable to be, to be made whole and to be made perfect. And if along the way we can, give them what God intended for them to have in the first place, in family and safety and security and all of those things, then that's a great blessing. But we don't want to miss giving them, the greatest blessing and the greatest, and meeting their greatest need by just meeting some temporal needs and then moving on.
Yeah. Around here, my dad coined a phrase that I think maybe he may have stolen it, and he does that. Preachers do that, but he says we are at Life Outreach International. We share God's love in word and deed, and that's what you're talking about. It's the gospel preached and the gospel demonstrated, and I 100% back you on that.
Yeah.
That is not necessarily in favor, and in some places it's being outlawed to say, we're going to place children, but we're going to place. I mean, you're saying you're even narrowing it to say if we're going to place them in Christian homes, that's even narrower than saying, well, we're going to place them in male, female, mother, father homes, which is coming under fire. Have you had any legal problems?
I mean, that stuff looms out there. But I think maybe the secret that is sort of an open secret in child welfare is the fact that the child welfare system in America needs evangelical Christians. But Bible believing conservative Christians walked away from the child welfare system, it would implode. And so there's a sense in which that, there are places where and pockets where our worldview is challenged and not accepted, but that challenge and that lack of acceptance can only go so far because at the end of the day, they need us. And the truth is that there's when you sort of get into the whole worldview behind it, there's a pragmatism that exists in all of this in child welfare. I mean, at the end of the day, people in government want the child welfare system to work.
Yeah.
They want children to be cared for. They want kids to be able to be reunified with their families if possible. They want the system to function well. Well, the system functions well when Christians are in it. And so we hear, and not necessarily from policymakers, not necessarily from people that are pushing those agendas, but from the people that are out on the street that are doing the work. They're saying, hey, we want those church people around. We want them to engage, and we want you to help us find more of them, and to find, to help us find families for kids, and to help us to find, safe, reliable places for children to be cared for, because they know Christians will do that. We've had incredible success with a program that leads churches to teach parenting classes to families who've lost their kids into foster care or are at the point of losing their kids into foster care. And these classes, Randy, they're biblically based, gospel centered, we're not hiding it at all. And the truth is that we have, judges and CPS workers and all kinds of people who are around that willingly, they at least tolerate those things being done. One, first of all, the church is doing it for free. No money's changing hands. And so the government, you can't play the separation of church and state card, because the state ultimately isn't paying for it. But more than that, it works.
Right.
And so you have churches that are, that are bringing the gospel to bear in the lives of these parents. Kids are going home and staying home. They're being, enveloped by the church. And at some point, whether you like it or not, when the scorecard that you're being judged by is whether the system works or not, they like us being there because we help it work.
It's amazing.
And,
Yeah, it's amazing the difference between, trying to help children get into a good home versus trying to raise money for your next campaign. So maybe if you want to see where people are at, just go, what's the motivation here? Okay. How many children do you have?
So I have three.
We
have three kids. Yeah. All who came home through adoption, from Ukraine.
From Ukraine. Right. That's where I was going.
Yeah.
Tell us about that. 'Cause that's not always easy. Typically it's actually more difficult than, my parents, were over here in Fort Worth. They just went to Dallas to get me. I mean, it's a short drive. You go all the way to Ukraine. You're dealing with other governments. You're dealing with other cultures. You're dealing with all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
But walk us through a little bit of your story, short version.
Yeah, Randy, the short story is, I went to public school in the South, and so I couldn't find Ukraine on a map, probably partially because it didn't exist when maps were being drawn when I was in school. But seriously, we began the process and really, believed that God was going to build our family through adoption. My wife Denise and I, we prayed and were just very open to adopting in any kind of circumstance. We looked at everything from domestic infant adoption to foster to adopt to international adoption, and the Lord just really continued to bring international adoption up in front of us. And frankly, God kind of orchestrated some circumstances for us that we ended up reuniting with some friends in ministry, and actually doing some ministry work together with some friends who had adopted from Ukraine. And so at this time when Ukraine was beginning to kind of raise up in our consciousness, and it was these weird things like, getting stuff in the mail about orphans in Ukraine and things from people that we didn't get on their mailing list and didn't know why we were getting these things. And then all of a sudden we find out that these friends that we've reconnected with and have a ministry connection with, they have a connection to Ukraine. And like, there were all these things that happened. Long story short, God just made it obvious to us that was where we were supposed to go. It was hard.
Yeah.
We saw Ukraine at one point closed because of a corruption scandal.
Yeah.
And so we were kind of left in limbo. But at the end of the day, we adopted an 18-month-old little boy. He came home in January of 2004. He's now 21 years old, and he is awesome, and is doing great. And he's the youngest of our three kids now. So God just kind of radically transformed the trajectory of our lives with that first adoption, and that's where orphanology came from. That's where the conviction to really digging into the scriptures and saying, how, what are we supposed to do in this area, and how does this relate to the gospel? That led us to adopt another little boy about 6 years later, who was 7 years old. He's now 22, and then we have a daughter who's 28, who came home at 14 from Ukraine, and so we had three very different adoption experiences. Yeah. But I can tell you, man, if you want to know how to be completely unknown and completely disregarded, just make yourself subject to a foreign government, because of all the people that they may care about, generally, we're not it. And so, but Randy, it was such a beautiful experience to walk through that and to be in a place where we were wholly, completely dependent upon God. There was nothing we could do. There was no phone to pick up. There was no senator on the other end of the phone. There was nothing that we could sort of, twist any dials or pull any levers in life in order to try to make something happen. And we saw God do some amazing, miraculous things, to bring us through that process and to bring us to our children. And probably the greatest thing about the three adoption stories that we have is are those moments that we saw God show up in ways that we could. I mean, we knew he was there, we knew he was active, but in those moments where he pulled back the curtain of heaven a little bit and showed us that he was active, and he was for us, and he was for our children, and he was orchestrating our circumstances. And now to be able to tell those stories and to give that gift to our children, that they know that no matter the start that they got off to, no matter the difficulty of, that they've experienced in life and in periods along the way, that they know that the hand of God was on them, and he's given them a story, in their adoption, that's a tangible reminder of the way that he cares for them. And that's resulted in three kids who love Jesus and are following him, and just have great confidence about the fact that God's going to use them to do something important. And that's a pretty cool gift as a parent.
Well, yeah. And yeah, both to them and to you, right?
Yeah, for sure.
I'm curious, when Russia invaded. Now, I mean, I know there was Crimea back in, or was that 2015 or something? So this is kind of not new if you've been paying attention to Ukraine very long.
Well,
but what?
And our daughter's from Crimea, and so not to interrupt, but
Yeah.
so we've gone through it twice.
Okay.
We lived through it in 2015. It happened again, in this most recent invasion. And so this is a story that we've kind of watched play out a couple of times in our family. And it's tough.
That's what I was going to ask.
It's been hard to watch.
Yeah. What about for the kids? Because do they feel any kind of connection to Ukraine still?
Yeah, all of them have experienced it differently, and I think some of it has to do with their age and when they came home, and those sorts of things.
Sure.
Our daughter, who's 14, she has a biological sister who still lives in Crimea. They talk probably once a week or so. Her sister's life is incredibly hard in Crimea. It was hard before. It's harder now. Economically, it's a pretty rough situation that she finds herself in, after the invasion. And probably the hardest thing in all that is the fact that, at least two of our kids still have, they have relationships. They know people. They're connected to biological family, that sort of thing. And it's the not being able to get to them, and the uncertainty of the things that they're living in and living through. The truth is that when things like this happen, the people that are already vulnerable in a society become infinitely more vulnerable.
Yeah.
And so if you're looking at people that have means, that are trying to flee Ukraine or trying to move themselves into safety or whatever, we saw the huge move of refugees. Well, think about being a kid who doesn't have anything and can't advocate for themselves, that can't make a decision for themselves. They're relying upon someone else to care for them. And that's the plight of orphans in Ukraine. A lot of these kids were in institutions not because they don't have parents, by the way. A lot of kids in Ukraine were in institutions because they have special needs that couldn't be cared for well in their community. And so they actually have been placed in orphanages because that's where their therapy needs were being met. That's where they were getting the specialized care that they needed. And kind of one of the untold stories in all this is that when the war broke out, they dismissed those kids from orphanages and sent them home. And they sent them home into families where their families aren't resourced to be able to take care of them. And there's been a lot of strife and a lot of difficulty that's resulted. We've got a ministry partner in Odessa, kind of in the southern part of Ukraine there, who left for a time into Romania. They've actually gone back to Odessa, and their ministry now is caring for families who have children with significant special needs. And so they're providing food, they're providing gas and diesel for generators, they're doing all kinds of things in order to help these families to subsist, because frankly they have no other way to survive. And where their ministry once was helping to provide tutoring and educational needs and support for those families in one way, now they're driving four-wheel drive vehicles around bombed out roads in order to take supplies into those families, just to make sure that they can subsist another day.
Yeah, it has been hard. We've actually, at Life Out International, not long after Chernobyl, we founded some what we call life centers, which are basically some homes for children, not really a full orphanage kind of thing. And our partners, and fortunately, ours, literally, you can see the mountains of Poland from where ours are situated,
Right.
which we didn't know, but
Sure.
that worked in our favor during this invasion. But one of our mission partner in Kyiv, because they have some operations there. I think it was his son was hit by a bullet, kind of thing. I mean, you're literally risking your life to work in Ukraine right now, even if you're just helping the orphans.
Yeah.
So
we all know stories and have friends who have have lost loved ones. We have people that we know that have died in the war. There's a friend that I knew that they were ministering to kids who had aged out of the orphanage, and so there was a girl that was she was, I think, 21, 22 years old, a mama. Had a little girl living in an apartment building in the eastern part of Ukraine, and a rocket hit their apartment building, and she and her daughter were killed. And this is a kid who had come through the orphanage system, who'd made it, who was living well, who was being helped by the church, who had was making a way for herself and for her daughter, and she was succeeding, and her life was taken as just really needlessly in the midst of this conflict, and it seems as though that as this thing has kind of ground on, the problem now is there is just no infrastructure left in a significant portion of the country. And so, but many of the people that are stuck are widows and orphans who don't have the ability to be able to get out. And so they're literally hiding and hanging on for their lives in in the midst of a situation that ultimately is not going to get any better anytime soon.
Well, I mean, it gets a little bit better when somebody like you guys show up. Thank God. I want to show people the website. This is lifelinechild.org. Now, are you guys accepting donations to help in Ukraine?
We are. We've been doing that since the beginning of the conflict, and so when the war broke out, we started a fund. You actually can go under our Global Orphan Care section on the website, and there's information there about Ukraine. There's a way that you could give, and it goes directly to support ministries like the one that I talked about, where they're providing for the tangible needs of families and kids.
And sharing the gospel, which I do think I think you got to do both. And here's why I ask, because we got a truckload of tax money going over there right now, and there are a lot of organizations out raising money, but there's been historical corruption. I mean, Ukraine has just been rife with corruption for years, decades. And frankly, I don't trust our own government right now. And some of these pop-up organizations help Ukraine. They show some things that'll make you cry, and you don't really know who they are. And there's someone on the inside who's been doing it, who's got people on the ground, who actually helps the widows and orphans. Have you seen some of this other stuff and gotten a little concerned about maybe some of the things not getting where they need to get to help people?
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly. I mean, we probably. I really can't. I haven't seen that, and I'll be honest with you. Because we've been really focused on the people that we work with directly.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I can trust you guys.
Yeah. And I think part of my story is as well. I've been to Ukraine 26 times over the course of the last 20 years, and and so I've taught at Key Theological Seminary for a number of years, taught church planners there. One of the cool things that I've been able to be privileged to see happen through all this are uh, pastors that planted churches that didn't, like, these guys haven't run away. They've pressed in, they've stayed, they've continued to shepherd their congregations, they've continued to try to love on and to provide for people in the midst of, people that are having their world, their livelihood, everything about them turned upside down. And there's been this incredible network of Christians around Ukraine that have banded together. And I resonate to some degree with what you said about, I just think, government and institutional solutions don't, like, they're just not effective and they're not efficient. But God's people are.
Yeah.
And when we put things that ultimately belong to God into the hands of God's people, the Lord has a way of meeting needs and stretching things in ways that are pretty remarkable. And so we've been able to see, and frankly, the church is flourishing in Ukraine. That's part of the crazy part of this. Under the, all of the fighting and the strife and the lack of infrastructure and all that sort of stuff, there's a story that's not being told, and it's the story of people that are having everything that they put their hope in stripped away from them, and people that have never been open to the gospel, that are not only open to the gospel, but people that are giving their lives to Jesus, and people that are following Jesus in the middle of all this stuff. And that's because there are faithful churches and faithful pastors who've chosen to stay. Yeah. And so if you give to organizations like ours, we're not the only ones that are there. We're not the only ones that are, right, that are doing work like this. But when you support organizations that support those kinds of ministries, your money's going to get to the right place. Right. But more than that, it's going to get to the right place for the right purpose, which is first and foremost, pointing people toward the hope that we have in Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really my point, is that if you want to help in Ukraine, you're watching, and I'd just be very careful. And obviously, Life Outreach International, we have a small operation there. Lifeline Children's Services, even more extensive network. They're plugged into people on the ground with the gospel in hand. So they're not just going to get, shelter or food, water, clothing, things like that, all of which I think are essential and part of demonstrating the gospel. But they're going to hear the gospel as well. They're going to see it lived out in the people that are working with it through the churches. If you're going to help in Ukraine, go with an organization like these guys right here, lifelinechild.org. And like Rick said, there's a designation. If you designate your funds to any nonprofit, any 501c3, they have to use those funds for that purpose that you designate. So if you really want to make sure, whether it's with us or with anybody else, write on there what it's for, if it's a check or there's a designation in the donation form. It'll get to where you want it to go.
That's right.
So appreciate you. Is there anything you want to add before I let you go? I love the update. Man, I love the
I just think,
hope.
Probably the last thing I'd say is just because we're in November, National Adoption Month, this is a, great opportunity, I think, for folks that are considering adoption to get information, to find out more. Great opportunity for churches to really be able to surround and love on and pray for and acknowledge adoptive families, encourage them, during this time. And so we love what we get to do. We love the place that we get to fulfill in that story of families. But we also understand that it's a big story, and it's a lifetime, and and I mean, even stories like yours, and stories of you and your family, and the fact is that in the church we need to celebrate. We need to celebrate adoption. We need to celebrate God's people, acting like and doing the things that mirror who our God is. In National Adoption Month, I can think of no better time than for us to put a spotlight on something that really illuminates the heart of God, but I think also really kind of brings a smile to the face of our Lord as well.
Oh yeah. Well, okay. So if it's National Adoption Month and I'm an adoptee, shouldn't I be getting something? I mean, do I get a gifts or party?
Absolutely. Hey, come to Birmingham and like I'll take you out for some barbecue and we'll have a party. How about that?
All right. Thanksgiving's got me a little busy, but I appreciate the invitation. Dr. Rick Morton, thank you for being with us today. I'm encouraged by the work that you're doing and the hope that we hear in places like Ukraine, and just keep fighting the good fight.
Man, thanks, Randy. It's always good to talk to you and appreciate the time.
Appreciate you guys out there watching. Hey, you better hit share on this one quick because National Adoption Month is only got another, 14 days or so. So let's get the word out. Seriously, if you want to help in Ukraine, I do recommend lifelinechild.org. And we welcome your support here, but we're all on the same team, right? We're on God's team, sharing the gospel, demonstrating the gospel, and we appreciate you being a part of that today. Got more good stuff for you. I'll see you again next time here on Life Today Live.
Nobody can prevent you from doing the will of God.